Hello everybody, welcome to session 2 out of 4 of the e-sgol history catch-up sessions. Mr. Penny will be presenting today, but just before I hand over, for anybody wondering where to access the recording of these live sessions, I've posted the link which you can use to access these recordings in the Q&A section. Okay, there's an announcement there. If you just follow that link, you'll be able to see all of them. And then over to Mr. Penny.
Hello everybody. Well, today's session I'm going to focus on source skills. And this is the first of 2 sessions with myself. So I'm thinking I will cover the USA paper and the Germany paper. So they're both Unit 2 papers, but also I'm going to spend time looking at the 4 main source questions. So this week I will do questions 1, 2 and 3, which are indicated on the right side of the screen. And then the session 2 weeks from now, I'll focus mostly on questions 3 and 4. So the utility questions, how useful questions, I will look at in 2 weeks' time. So I'm hoping you'll get a lot out from today. I'll normally spend a few minutes on an American question, then a few minutes on Germany and vice versa. OK, so here we go. So I'm going to start with looking at a typical question 1. Now, question 1s are fairly straightforward, and if you follow the trend properly and the method, you should score pretty highly. They're worth 6 marks, and as you can see, I put an example from the USA question. Using a source and your knowledge, describe how minority groups were mistreated. Now, for each source, I've also indicated where I recovered the source from, and I've also included the annotations, which you always get at the bottom of each source. The annotations are vital, and you can often understand a few things already from the actual annotation. So if you all spend a few seconds looking at the photograph, you spot a number of things already in terms of what the content informs you about. So I picked out a few things that I noticed initially. So on the next slide. So I made a list of what I picked out from the source itself. And clearly you can see a difference between races in terms of how they are treated, different facilities. So Black Americans are kept physically away from white Americans. I also used the annotation because the annotation says the word segregation. So it clearly shows segregation between Black Americans and white Americans. An interesting point that I noticed was the actual fact that segregation is not an issue to be ashamed of in the South. As you can see here, the signpost is rather obvious, isn't it? So it's a part of their way of life, what I might call the Southern way of life. So there's probably about 2 or 3 points at least you can spot straight away from the source. Now, for a 6-mark question, you might find that, say, you score 2 or 3 by only discussing the content alone. But then, of course, the opportunity to expand and show the knowledge from your mind. And I've added in a few examples here. In this case, there are inferior resources for Black Americans, lack of funding, for example, in the Black American schools, examples of segregation, education, beaches, transport, etc. I also used that phrase, Southern way of life. Now, quite an interesting idea is a number of you, first instance, would have only discussed segregation. You saw that in the source and you expanded on it when you talked about examples of segregation. It's interesting to think how many of you at that time also thought of other aspects, because the question says treatment of. It doesn't talk about segregation on its own. So I've added in a few examples here. Economic inequality, as in first to be fired and last to be hired. Lack of promotion, you could tie in to that one, couldn't you? Brutal treatment, like the violence of the KKK, lynchings, tar and feather, floggings, castrations, murders, kidnapping, ordered to leave town. There's so much more I could have included in this answer, of course. But I'd like to think that we've included there some good examples from both the content and own knowledge. I also noticed the question minority groups, so you could have addressed other races or other ethnic groups who were mistreated, like the Native Americans, of course, and maybe immigrants, in particular the new immigrants, for example, those from Eastern Europe. So I think that's a good source to start with, to give you an example of how we can approach the question. I like to think also that you might steer away from using the word says or tells me. You might use words like demonstrates, illustrates, highlights, remarks, discusses. So question 1 is a fairly straightforward question, introducing both content and own knowledge. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to show you a question from the Germany paper. Using the source and your knowledge, describe how people are affected by war. Now, obviously, you would say German people affected by World War II in a main assessment question. Now, if you look at it, first of all, you're thinking, are they marching to war? Maybe, maybe not. But if you look at the bottom of the page, the annotation always tells you a little bit more. Volkssturm. And it would probably tell you who the Volkssturm are. I'm sure many of you are thinking already and remembering that the Volkssturm is the phrase for the Home Guard. Another clue in the annotation, that it gets worse towards the end of the war. And maybe November 44 is a time where the war is ravaging and it's raging on, and maybe the need for what you might call older people to sign up for the war. So have a think now for yourselves and what you learn about the effects of war. Spend maybe 10 seconds looking at the photograph. See if you can pick out, say, 3 points from the source before I start highlighting it for you. And if you find that at times that are missed out and you wish to put them in the Q&A section, that's fine. If you have any questions as I go along, please don't hesitate to ask either. So that's question 2. Let's have a look then. So what does it tell us? What does it inform us? What does it highlight for us? What can we see? What can we infer? Well, the main hints are people of an older age are trained to be in the military. The Home Guard were taught military drills, use of artillery, use of weapons. They are trained to be soldiers for the Third Reich, aren't they? We can also assume that high numbers of people are involved. You can also see a variety of classes or different types of people. But what you do notice is they're all of an age you might not see as typical military service age. There's quite a lot there, isn't it? You could also say it looks like an example of propaganda, perhaps, that they are marching together. The crowds are there to will them on. Notice for this question, I've never once discussed who produced the source. Is it useful? Is it reliable? Is it biased, etc.? Who the origin of the source is? Because it is not relevant. The question is asking you, using the source and knowledge, what do you know? So they're the main parts I picked out from the source. So what about knowledge then? What else can we discuss? Well, the first point that I included was the military was stretched. So they're relying on those older than the fighting age. They're needed for the war effort. Maybe it shows total war. The idea that all aspects are affected by the crisis, whether that's soldiers, civilians. You could also discuss other aspects of war, the bombing campaigns like Dresden, Berlin and Cologne. An interesting point, at the end of World War II in Cologne, only 1 in every 8 children were of the right weight, as in they were severely malnourished, the other 7 out of 8. Transport communications hit severely. Minority groups treated. Most obvious is the treatment of the Jews in what we call the final solution or the Holocaust. Morale had been lowered dramatically following the defeat of the Aryan race, or the Aryan forces at Stalingrad. You could maybe discuss other groups who are starting to oppose Hitler. I'd like to think many of you are thinking of the name at the moment of Stauffenberg, as in the Stauffenberg plot to try to remove Hitler. There's plenty there, isn't it? So there's plenty for knowledge-wise from the photograph alone, and the annotation tells you so much. Then you'd hopefully have enough knowledge to add on examples in the response. I'll do one more question one here. One more question one. Back to the USA paper. Right, using the source and your knowledge, describe the Wall Street crash. Now, I haven't put the annotation in for this one because it's quite clear it's on the London Herald. OK. I'm not going to start discussing is it useful or not, or is it biased, or the origin of the source, because we don't need it. We're going to discuss what we know from our minds and from this charming source. So if you all look at it for 15 seconds and try to pick out a few things that you learn from the source. So try and pick out 2 or 3 things that stand out straight away. Four things stand out for me, I must admit. The crucial dates. The dates where it hit an all-time low. The impact on people's lives. The horrendous impact on the communities. The media report the lowering of share prices. Maybe we could call it a plummet, not a lowering, but an actual plummet. Maybe it shows the hysteria of the crowds assembling, wishing for their money to be returned. Maybe it highlights at the bottom of the page what went wrong. Maybe it highlights that there were people still questioning what actually happened in this Wall Street crash. Again, there's plenty there, isn't it? So what about our knowledge? So have a think now. What else can you remember in terms of what you remember about the Wall Street crash? So next page, we could have mentioned issues like over speculation, couldn't we? Over speculation. People gambled, people were too confident, maybe even arrogant with regards to share prices. The wish that they would keep going up and up and up and up and not falling. We could have talked about the panic selling, people dumping shares in the hope of rescuing their money. You could have mentioned the impact, life savings were lost, a real selling frenzy. You could have mentioned that it's the main cause, or maybe not the main cause, but the catalyst to the Great Depression. Maybe this event spurs on the Great Depression. So let's hopefully think that we can get lots from this source, can't we? Plenty from this source in terms of content and own knowledge. So that's question one. Now I thought we'd spend a few minutes looking at a typical question two. Question twos will reward you for your level of knowledge and understanding and your application of your knowledge here. So maybe a few lines would only secure you 2 marks, whereas a fair understanding may be more like 4 marks out of 8. So why did some German people vote for the Nazis? Now, if any of you wish to post some ideas in the Q&A section, you're welcome to do so. But I thought perhaps my 5 or 6 main themes I would include. And here we go. One thing I would say, if I was answering a describe question and I knew, say, 3 or 4 or 5 points, the one I knew most securely and with greater confidence, I would discuss first. And then I would probably try to connect together. Firstly, it is about the cause of. Secondly, in relation to the first point, the issue of. So I would try to link them together. For example, the role of Hitler, a charismatic speaker who organised a party post Munich Putsch, of course, who changed the party to a more peaceful orientated party in terms of the public persona was more peaceful, securing the ballot instead of using the bullet. World War I war hero, delivering of speeches, use of Hitler's ideology, for example, Lebensraum, anti-Semitism, anti-communism, the Führer principle. Then I might discuss, secondly, is the important issue of Nazi propaganda. And you might discuss the Nazi propaganda machinery in place, led by Joseph Goebbels. Thirdly, intimidation of voters. For example, the SA bullying voters and trying to break up meetings of anti-Nazi forces, such as the communists. The phrase lesser of two evils is a good reason why, isn't it? Many people thought the Nazis were troublesome, but not as problematic as perhaps the Communist Party. You might discuss some of the political issues regarding the Republic, like the overuse of Article 48 is an important one, isn't it? The overuse of this, which suspends democracy and leads to the breakdown of parliamentary democracy in Germany, the failure of Weimar to rescue Germany from the economic difficulties, being blamed for the impact of the Wall Street crash, being blamed for the starvation levels or people near starvation levels. So maybe Germany is in a time of chaos. And the coalition governments, two or more parties in a government, due to proportional representation, are unable to agree sufficiently to grant Germany a way out of this economic despair. And of course, there's the Treaty of Versailles, the legacy of this. Loss of armed forces, 100,000 troops allowed. A lack of a real military machinery being allowed in terms of battleships, tank battalions, etc. Geographical losses to Germany post-Versailles. So there's plenty to consider. Remember what I said, maybe you should discuss the 2 or 3 you know the best early in your answer. For example, you could have a range of questions, couldn't you, for question 2? For example, if I just mention a describe for America, describe why some Americans were in favour of prohibition. You might remember 6 or 7 key reasons. But if you think the health issues are the most important, you'd say that. Firstly, it was because of the dangers of alcohol to people's health. For example, liver disease, issues to do with the heart. So you then give 4 or 5 key reasons for prohibition. I'm now going to move to what we call question 3. So some students would have found questions 1 and 2 slightly easier. So now we're looking at number 3. Why is a source being produced? What is the purpose of this source? An 8-mark question. Maybe you could guess that if it's an 8-mark question, half of the marks available are from your source of evaluation and half are from your knowledge of the course or the issue at heart here. So if we can all just pause for a second and try to pick out 5 reasons why it was made. Look at the picture carefully. You should find at least 5 reasons. What are they trying to say about alcohol? What does the background images suggest about alcohol? Then look at the annotation. This is an important one. Look at the annotation here, as in who wrote the source. Now, what are we looking for? If I show you the next slide, for a purpose question, you might be tempted to discuss a few of these aspects. Sometimes the gut reaction is to say 4 reasons why it's made. That's quite straightforward. But then you may actually leave out issues like The content of the source. Context, what's happening? Context, what's happening outside the source. So look at the list I've given you. The origin of the source, all the W's, who, when and why, for example. What type of source is it? The nature of the source. The tone of the source, how is it made? What is it presenting? What's the argument it's trying to give? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is it exaggerating? Is it too dramatic? Who is the source aimed at? Audience. One of my favourites is Jeep. Jeep. Justify, educate, entertain, persuade. I would like to think that for every source you could ever see, at least 2 of Jeep are there. So can you all just think for 30 seconds on at least one of these? Try to think of some of these 4 you could use from Jeep. Right. Here's some examples that I thought of here. So why is it made? How about we go to the bottom of the page first? Justify and educate. Justify the growing support for a dry campaign. That's a good idea, isn't it? Keep Ohio dry, wasn't it? Was the kind of slogan here. So justify support for it. Educate people on the dangers of alcohol. So this Jeep idea, we've now got 2 already. Who are the audience they're aiming at? Maybe parents, because of guilt. Ohio residents, try to get them angry regarding alcohol. People who are against the idea of restricting access to alcohol. Try to convert these people to favouring prohibition. Now, if we look at the source, then we can see some of the purpose or some of the motives here. For example, they wish to tell people that alcohol causes poverty and crime. They wish to tell people that it makes alcohol makes people poor. Alcohol robs women and children. People are neglected as a result. Maybe it's trying to show that it is to growth in the population of prisons. Maybe its purpose is to tell people that it's a waste of resources because it says we waste grain. We look at the top of the grid. The purpose is to generate support for the ban of alcohol, to raise the profile of the Ohio Dry campaign. Publicity for it, to promote the idea. Create an anti-alcohol feeling of guilt. People are boozing, drinking, they should feel guilty of it. The dangers of alcohol. The purpose is to show the dangers of alcohol. It leads to poverty. The link to the German brewers, hence the word Hun. Resources wasting, criminal acts, violence, for example. So I would say there's plenty there in the source as to why it's made. The key thing is you use the correct language. The purpose is to, the source has an agenda in that it. The purpose of the source is to create an. The source has a rationale in that it wishes to. So there's some of the thoughts regarding the source content in terms of its purpose. Now, what about from our own knowledge? It's useful if we can integrate the content of the source with the actual outside knowledge. For example, maybe they wish to raise awareness during the war itself because the issue of German brewers. Maybe it's to promote, to increase membership for the groups like the ASL, Anti-Saloon League, not to be confused with the Anti-Flirt League, of course. Maybe, and I think the next point is a crucial one, maybe it's trying to get support in the southern states, in what we call the Bible Belt. Maybe it's there to highlight the issues regarding alcohol. For example, the loss of productivity, dangers to health, and addiction to alcohol. So this answer would be, firstly, the purpose is to. Secondly, a purpose is to. And you fill in the gaps, you fill in the details from the source and from your own knowledge. I'm hoping that was useful to you, that one. So how about we look at a Germany source? So we've got two left we can go through. One more Germany and one more American. Right, so spend some time, give yourself 30 seconds, looking at the source. Why is it made? What hints are in the source? Look at the annotation again. The annotation is on the right-hand side. So why is it made? Give you 10 more seconds to reflect and look at this. There are certain things that jump out at us straight away. One, the name Hitler. So the purpose is to emphasize, to promote the idea of the Führer. Our last hope, Hitler. So the purpose is to persuade people that all is lost if they do not vote for the Nazi party. They even use the phrase Nazi propaganda election poster. So the purpose is to win an election, to raise understanding and support for the Nazi party. There's plenty from just looking at the source alone. It shows a mass movement, isn't it? Mass movement of people who are desperate, who are living in dark times of real misery and loss of confidence. Look at the expressions on the people's faces. The female who can't feed her child, for example. People are lost here, aren't they? So why is it made? Again, think of these clues. Origin of the source, the tone of the source, audience, Jeep. I'll try and use two more from Jeep for this source. Justify, educate, entertain, persuade. So why is it made? So in terms of the content, I picked out a few possibles here. Look at the tone, halfway down the grid. The tone, it's morbid, it's depressing, anger inducing. Maybe it's there to create an anger. Maybe it's produced to show a morbid part of life, that Germany is beyond repair, which is desperate without the support of Adolf Hitler. Now think of Jeep. Justify supporting the Führer, justify supporting for the Nazi party, justify voting for Hitler. Educate people on the lack of morale in Germany. Hitler is indeed the last hope. Educating you on the dangers of other parties. To inform you that there is mass misery in Germany, sure, and it will get worse unless they vote for the Nazi party. Audience, the bottom of the page. Voters, obviously, those who are unemployed or whose careers were at risk. Parents, maybe. There's the sign of the little child in the mother's arms. Maybe it's targeting, for example, students who are now graduating. Trying to say to them that there's a lack of hope without the direction the Führer can bring. What else did I show? Top of the create support and adoration for the candidate. Organisation in a time of chaos is a phrase maybe of use here. The annotation says it, our last hope. The purpose is to be persuasive, a form of propaganda. To emphasize the main figurehead, whose name is highlighted in massive letters. So the purpose is to show how effective Hitler can be and how crucial Hitler is to the future of, at the time, Weimar Germany. Now, clearly, there's no way you would have included all of these points here from the content of the source. But you may well have considered a few of them. And obviously, I've pitched this at quite a high level for this question, as you can see. But you'd integrate the source and your knowledge. So some examples of knowledge. Why else did they create this poster in 1932? To raise awareness of the failures of the Weimar Republic. The coalition parties are not delivering. They're not bringing Germany out of the depression. Propaganda to encourage a mass membership of the party. Trying to discourage trying to encourage even a more distaste and disgust for the moderate political groups. So people vote for the extremists, in this case, the Nazi Party. The purpose is to remind people of the impact of the Wall Street crash on Germany. To bring about organisation. Maybe it's trying to show Hitler as a saviour, a new hope, the lesser of two evils. A saviour, somebody who can return Germany to its glories. Maybe the significance of 32 is important. A real rise in support for the Nazi Party at the time, and a decline in Germany of standards, decline of other parties like the more moderate parties, and presidential election year, as we know. So there's plenty to consider, isn't it? Ideally, you'd hope to include, say, a good few points in the content and knowledge, give 2 or 3 paragraphs. I think there's time for one more question from myself and another purpose question from the American course. So why was this source produced? If you look at the poster, there are plenty of hints here as to why it was made. Plenty. So what can you see? Look at the content in terms of the visuals. Also look at the obvious use of vocab in this poster. So why was it made? Look at the annotation. Well, I can see probably 3 hints already in the annotation as to why it was produced. So why is it made? From the source itself? Maybe it's, as the 5th point down illustrates, advertise the new film in 1927. Advertise a film so they raise profit levels. So they create an enthusiasm for the movie industry. Maybe it's to stress, in the 4th point, the positive nature of jazz. The family-orientated nature of jazz in this case, as in both genders take an interest in the music. They're trying to show the popularity of this new music style, perhaps. Maybe you need to look closer at the poster. It shows how important Warner Brothers are. It's trying to raise the profile of a movie industry. Maybe it's trying to raise the profile of the star himself. Big red letters, Al Jolson. So maybe it's about the star system, that stars are vital. Maybe it's trying to encourage a greater appreciation of jazz music. Notice how happy the people are in this poster. There's plenty there. Look at the top line, supreme triumph, as in a wonderful piece of movie making. So if we move back to the left side again, it's to raise the profile of film stars like Al Jolson in this case. Maybe it's to create interest in the movie industries with the idea of profit margins and support. Maybe it's to generate interest in jazz music, both within the Bible Belt and, of course, the city like New York and Chicago, where there's so much potential with regards to jazz. Let's go to Jeep, bottom of the page. What do we have? Persuade people to support Hollywood and jazz music. more importantly, to part with their wages and their wealth, to get people through the door into the jazz club. Maybe it's there to educate people on the newly emerging style of music. Maybe it's to create a real atmosphere of support for Hollywood and, of course, music. Maybe it's created to create support for this new industry, which is developing, the Hollywood industry. Now think of the tone of the source, the tone of the source. A positive, exciting, embracing tone. Maybe it's rather dramatic. So instead of saying it's not useful because, or however the source is biased in that you promote it to the question. The purpose of the source is to create a positive imagery of Hollywood. The purpose of the source is to show that music and Hollywood are vital parts of a new American age in the 1920s in a persuasive and dramatic fashion. And of course, it's to advertise the new film in 1927. If I go to the next page then, what else could we have included from our knowledge? Production companies wish to raise profits during the boom period, of course. The intention was to raise profile and profitability during this time. And they're exploiting, aren't they? The 1920s, a time of economic growth. So for many American people, it's a time of real, vibrant economic activity. Is it maybe the purpose is to create support for the era of the Jazz Age, a period of social change, of great transformation in society? Maybe it's to illustrate the impact of talkies and to show the evolution of filmmaking at this particular time. Of course, the purpose is to highlight the creation of movie pictures, or motion pictures, sorry. Maybe the agenda is to make a profit and raise revenues for these massive, wonderful film companies. From our own knowledge, we could say that there was a heavy emphasis on advertising to encourage viewers. And maybe even to stress popular movie stars. You know, as students, we're able to utilize our growing knowledge and talk about people like Charlie Chaplin and Clara Bow. So maybe the purpose is to highlight these individuals, what we call the star system. So I think you can see there's plenty here to discuss, isn't it, with regards to the source. So think back to the source again. OK, what you can see in the source itself, visual aspects, use of vocabulary as well, and of course, use of content from our own minds. And we try to give examples of what's outside the source, the context of the source. The context, 1920s, the war is over, World War I is now finished. The boom period, the 1920s, the Jazz Age, women's lives improving. The impact of talkie films on the movie industry. And I'd like to think we've now gone over, I think it's 7 questions in this brief amount of time. So I'm hoping that had an impact on your level of understanding. Thank you.